Hey students, this is the final third part of the Religion and Reform recorded lecture. And so up to this point, we've covered the Second Great Awakening. We've also covered some of the famous writers at this time, as well as new groups that formed, such as the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, these utopian communities, the Transcendentalists, and so forth. In this third and final part for the Religion and Reform lecture, we're going to go over kind of what was going on in some of the cities, also some racism and nativism at this time. And then the last topic is really the most important for this part, is that's the reform movements that come out of the Second Great Awakening. And so these reform movements are tremendously important, and will be on quizzes and will be on your next test and so forth. So first thing we're going to cover is urban popular culture. And so you look at this population data on this slide right here, you can see kind of how cities have grown. New York was the largest city. It used to be Philadelphia, but what changed for New York being the largest and kind of overcoming Philadelphia, and that's the Erie Canal. And we covered that in the economic transformation lecture. And so Philadelphia was the most populated city until the Erie Canal opened up. And that made New York the most important port city in the country. And before that, it was actually New Orleans was the most important port city after the Louisiana Purchase. So you can see that Philadelphia grows, and it grows quite a bit, excuse me, but it doesn't grow as much as New York does. And so New York grows tremendously from immigration. And so you have a lot of cities on the East Coast that end up having a lot of immigrants, but particularly New York is the largest. Then you have Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and others that really grew in population. Later in U.S. history, too, we talk about like Chicago and many other cities becoming, San Francisco, becoming big centers of immigration. And so what you end up having is this tremendous growth ends up coming because of, the birth rate and also immigration. So, for instance, by 1860, New York had become a huge metropolis with more than 1 million residents. Now today, cities have well over 1 million residents. And there was about 813,000 alone in Manhattan, and another 266,000 in the adjacent community of Brooklyn. So as you can imagine, they don't really build cities at this time that great. And so a lot of these tenement dwellings that these immigrants lived in were terrible. One air ventilation shaft, did not have modern plumbing. And I used to have an area of New York called the Lung Block that we actually have a lecture in U.S. history too. We talk about the growth of cities and just how terrible it is. But you cannot pay me enough money to go back and live in some of these urban cities with the unsanitary conditions that they had at this time. Many rural young men found only hard work and hard life in the cities. And so one of the things you'll see happen, and it'll be a trend slowly throughout U.S. history, and it picks up the pace around the turn of the century, around 1900, is that rural settlers moving into urban areas for jobs and so forth. So when they work for these low wages, a lot of times it was in factories. Sometimes they also found work as paid operatives or clerks in hundreds of mercantile manufacturing firms. Young women also told as live-in domestic servants for wealthy families. What a domestic servant was is they were like a maid. They would do their laundry, their cooking. And so a lot of times domestic service dealt with laundry. So there was no washing machines back then. So you had to wash laundry by hand. It was a very tedious task. That's why you had all these clotheslines to let clothes dry, and so forth. And it's really tough for some of these women who were single and so forth to find work. Thousands more scraped out a bare living as needlewomen in New York's booming clothing manufacturing industry. And one of the things that we covered in the economic transformation lecture is that women were paid less than men at this time, because the factory owners at that time, in theory, thought that men could do more work than women. It's not always necessarily true. Thousands of young women ended up turning to prostitution. Eventually, when we get to the first module in U.S. history too, we talk about these laws that got passed to outlaw prostitution. But prostitution was unfortunately rampant in many of these cities. In the 1850s, a study showed that more than 6,000 prostitutes in New York City were operating. 3/5 of them were native-born Americans, and most were young, between 15 and 20 years old. Half were or had been domestic servants and had children, and half were inflicted with syphilis, which is an STD. So not good there. One of the things that you'll see as well is popular entertainment. became a big part of this new urban culture. Men bet a lot on horse racing, also rat terrier fighting and so forth. Also, what was called cockfighting. They would take two male chickens and have them fight, usually to the death, and they would bet on those. And there were some people that lost and squandered wealth, and some that gained wealth as a result of that betting. People went and saw Shakespeare's plays like Richard III. Middle-class couples could venture out to the huge Broadway Tabernacle to listen to an abolitionist lecture and see the renowned Hutchinson family singers in New Hampshire, or visit the Museum of Oddities, which was like hoaxes, created by P.T. Barnum, the great cultural entrepreneur and founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus. And so a lot of you may have seen the movie The Greatest Showman, and that a fascinating kind of musical movie and so forth. Really, but the most popular, most original theatrical entertainments were what's called the minstrel shows, performed by white actors in blackface. So basically, they would be a white actor who would paint his or her face black to appear as a black person. And basically, what these minstrel shows were a complex blend of racist caricature and social criticism. These shows began around 1830 as a comic song and dance routines. The most famous was this minstrel show called Jim Crow. Actually, it was called Jumping Jim Crow. And that's actually where the term the Jim Crow South came from, because it basically made fun of these racial stereotypes and so forth in the South. And so referring to segregation, and it was popular even after the Civil War, which is why the Jim Crow South took the name. It was a very racist comic theatrical play and so forth. And it kind of blended a weird shuffle dance and jump with unintelligible lyrics delivered in a Negro dialect. And so what historians are referring to when they say that is they were basically making fun of how slaves at that time talked. There's no way to get around it. It was a very racist play. These actor-singers poked racist fun at African Americans. They depicted them and particularly portrayed them as lazy, sensual, and irresponsible, while using them as a vehicle for social criticism. The minstrels also ridiculed the drinking habits of Irish immigrants. So they weren't just racist towards African Americans, also racist towards Irish, and parroted the speech of recent German arrivals. So they picked on Germans and denounced women's demands for political rights, and also mock the arrogance of upper class men. So these minstrel shows did actually make fun of a bunch of different groups. It was the way that they made fun of them that made it so racist and so forth. So these minstrel shows do pick on several different groups, but that's still not denying the fact that they were very racist and how they did that and so forth. But by the 1830s, most new residents of New York City were foreign born. That shows you how much New York City had grown in immigration. By 1855, 200,000 Irishmen and women lived in the city, along with about 110,000 Germans. Now, the difference between the Irish and the Germans is the Irish, because of the Irish potato famine primarily, not every single Irish was poor when they immigrated, but a lot of them were, was because of the potato famine. The potato famine wiped them out. They used every little bit of money they had left just to get over to the United States. Because they were broke when they arrived, they could only stay in eastern cities, just because they weren't able to afford to go west. The Germans, on the other hand, had a variety of different economic circumstances when they came, and so many of them were able to move west and create their own unique German towns and communities. And so these are kind of interesting. And one of the things that you'll see too with the Germans is oftentimes Germans would create their own German newspapers, their own German towns, like New Braunfels in Texas was a German town. Fredericksburg was a German town. And one thing about the Germans that you got to understand in American history, they were really good at trying to maintain their German heritage. And so usually when you have an immigrant group, by the third generation, they had become fairly Americanized. There are immigrant groups that are exceptions to this, the Germans being one of them. The Germans would maintain their German heritage for 6, even 7 generations, you would have these German towns where they would never even learn English. They would continue to speak German throughout for a few generations. And so a lot of things in American history that are very popular today really are German influence. Like, for instance, sausages. So like bratwurst, if we would grill those around the holidays and so forth, or if you like breakfast sausage, or of course we have Italian flavored sausages and so forth. Hamburgers, the use of ground beef, that was a German development. Sauerkraut was another German development, and also beer. The Germans brought over beer, which is popular in the U.S. So they really became part of the city's culture. The mass of impoverished Irish immigrants, particularly fleeing potato famine, found allies in the American Catholic Church, which soon became an Irish-dominated occupation. And so one of the things that you'll see is that Catholicism is actually going to overtake any Protestant denomination as being the largest religious group in American history. And it's because of so many Irish Catholics and German Catholics who immigrated to the United States, and later Italians and other Catholic groups. So one of the things, though, that you'll see is you'll see a backlash politically from this. So now the Democratic Party really recruited the Irish because they used them to vote for their candidates. Now, one of the things that develops with the Democratic Party in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s is they would develop what's called the political machines. Now, eventually, every political party in American history is going to establish these political machines, but the Democrats were one of the first ones to do it. And so how that worked is they would recruit Irish as they arrived on the docks and say, all right, hey, I tell you what, you guys need to find work. Boom, I'll get you a job. You guys need a place to stay. All right, it's taken care of. But once you become a citizen and you get to vote, you vote for who I tell you to vote for. If not, you'll lose your job. You'll be kicked out of your home and so forth. And so they kind of, in some ways, manipulated the Irish. Now, there are eventually going to be Irish groups that form to protect themselves from getting targeted like this and getting manipulated. So let's talk about the nativist group, because many native-born New Yorkers denounced this ethnic diversity and created a nativist movement that was a final aspect of this new urban culture. Beginning in the mid-1830s, nativists opposed further immigration and mounted a cultural and political assault on foreign-born residents. Kid gangs assaulted Irish youth. Employers hired Irish workers for on the most menial jobs, and temperance reformers denounced the German fondness for beer. In 1844, the American Republican Party, with the endorsement of the Whigs, swept to victory in the city elections by focusing on the emotional issues of temperance and the anti-Catholic nativism. The Washington Temperance Society advocated for temperance as well. And so you kind of have the Whig political party being kind of anti these immigrants, and you do have some Democrats who are like this as well, particularly in the South and some of the Midwestern states. The Democratic Party in the Eastern states sometimes were the ones that would have political machines that would try to recruit the Irish and so forth. So the thing about the nativist movement, if you remember this, okay, big key thing, they only like native-born Americans. So if you're foreign-born, nativists wouldn't like you. Okay, so the two groups that they target particularly are the Germans and the Irish. Now, the temperance reformers, those that are trying to ban the sale of alcohol, two of the groups that they targeted, particularly that drank very heavily, was the Germans and the Irish. Now, historically speaking, they did drink very heavily. The Irish drank very heavily for a couple of reasons. One, their water source back in Ireland was not very good. In fact, in the 1700s, Guinness was founded to try to brew beer that could be so you can basically get liquids out of it and so forth. And also because the Irish were impoverished, and not just Irish, but in general at this time, a lot of the poorer people in the country tend to drink the heaviest. Now, alcohol consumption in the first half of the 1800s is actually worse than it is today. The average American in the early half of the 1800s drank, on average, 7 gallons of liquor a year. That is a lot of alcohol. And also the alcohol content per volume was also higher. So alcoholism was actually far worse in the first half of the 1800s than it is today. The Germans culturally drank beer and so forth, and it was a very much a cultural thing for them, because they did it also because of water sources and whatnot. But just it was a cultural thing, and so a lot of the breweries and taverns were owned by Germans. So fast forward to World War I, when the United States is fighting Germany in World War I. The reason why the 18th Amendment was passed that brought about prohibition, which is prohibiting the sale of alcohol, it was passed primarily because it was seen as anti-German, because most German or majority of the taverns in the country were owned and run by German Americans. So if World War I had to happen, prohibition would never have been passed. All right, so let's talk about the reform movements and how very much important each of these are. So the abolitionist movement is, to me, really the biggest. I mean, by the 1850s, it does become the largest reform movement. And as you know, the issue of slavery is one of the three causes of the American Civil War, and slavery is the biggest cause of the Civil War of the three. And so the 13th Amendment gets passed the last few months of the war. And so the abolitionist movement, basically, really because of the issues of the 1850s and events that lead the Civil War, abolitionist becomes the biggest and most talked about reform movement of that day and age. So let's actually talk about how the abolitionist movement actually began. There was the first anti-slavery society began in the 1700s. Actually began by one of our founding fathers, close friend of John Adams, a guy named Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a medical doctor. And so really the abolitionist movement kind of gained steam from what actually happened in Britain. Great Britain, thanks to one of my favorite people in world history, a guy named William Wilberforce. There's an interesting movie about him called Amazing Grace. William Wilberforce actually spent his entire life in Parliament trying not only to get abolition passed, but also really the whole abolishment of the slave trade. He does that first in about 1807, 1808, and then eventually about 4 to 7 days before he died, slavery was abolished in the 1830s throughout the entire British Empire. In fact, there's a Wilberforce Award given every year internationally for kind of like the biggest human rights advocate and efforts that groups and people have done. So, but he had written to a lot of Americans, particularly Thomas Jefferson, and unfortunately didn't convince Thomas Jefferson that he should become an abolitionist. But it spills from Britain into the United States. And so when the Second Great Awakening happens, you have some of these northern and midwestern ministers that are getting moved, and they feel this deep conviction, so to speak, about the issue of slavery, and so they push for abolition of slavery. So it really also begins among free blacks living in the North, and begins in the 1790s. And so kind of how these free black leaders did in the North is they pushed for a strategy of social uplift. They encouraged free blacks to elevate themselves through education, temperance, moral discipline, and hard work. So these free blacks reformers were also participatory in other reform movements like temperance and education reform. By securing respectability, they argued blacks could assume a position of equality with whites. And to promote that goal, black leaders found an array of churches, schools, and self-help associations. So they did more than just abolition, but abolition was what they were most known for. There was one particular journal that they created called Freedom's Journal that became the first African-American newspaper. The Black quest for respectability elicited a violent response from whites in Boston, Pittsburgh, and many other northern cities. So it's not just the South that was dealing with racism and prejudice. Some of these people in these cities refused to accept African-Americans as their social equals. African-American leaders like David Walker called for slaves to revolt. Now, David Walker is a guy's name that you want to take notes on. He frequently appears on tests and also the AP exam and quizzes. So make sure you take note of him. In 1830, when African Americans met in Philadelphia for a convention, they demanded freedom and equality for all members of the race. To attain what they called race equality, they urged free blacks to use every legal means, including petitions and other forms of political protest, to break slavery. Now, Nat Turner's revolt, I want you to highlight this or take notes on it. Very important. It was a very violent revolt. There was a couple pretty big slave revolts in American history. You had the Stono County Rebellion or slave revolt that took place in Module 1. You also have another slave revolt that was attempted with Denmark Vesey. But Nat Turner, who was actually self-educated, was a slave in Virginia and actually became a Christian in the Second Great Awakening, and said he had received this vision that he should lead people out of slavery. And so raised support, was got others to join his cause, ended up slaughtering the family that owned him. And then they killed about 55 men, women, and children. The thing is that what led it to be unsuccessful is eventually the whites of Virginia kind of outnumber them and are able to eventually surround them, and they hang all of them that were trying to escape and lead this rebellion. Now, what is sad is that two things come out of this that were unintended consequences of the rebellion. One is that there were tougher slave codes. Before, slaves on plantations, particularly ones that were well trusted, could be sent to deliver messages to nearby plantations, were able to get an education if the planter wanted to. But then what you end up having is after this, you have really planters and actually laws that were passed at the state and local level that prevent some of this stuff from happening. They put curfews on blacks that were slaves and so forth in the South. And what was sad is Virginia almost passed a gradual emancipation bill. Now, this had long-term consequences because had Virginia done that in the early 1830s, they would have had all their slavery abolished by 1861. And there's really no way the South could have fought as long as it did and drug on as it did. And the South would have been as successful as it was for the first couple of years of the war had Virginia not seceded. So this had lasting unintended consequences that are tragic. And so one thing I did forget to mention is that Nat Turner led this revolt after a solar eclipse, which I thought was kind of cool. So here's David Walker. His famous work is Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Now, you got to understand that the term colored was not necessarily derogatory. Actually, African Americans refer to themselves as colored at that time. Now, it's no longer a term that's used today by any means. Actually, for the U.S. Census, if you were an African American, they would classify your race as colored. Now, I had an African American friend of mine in college. He brought up a good point where he said, "John, white people ought to be called colored because when you get embarrassed, you turn red. When you get sick, you turn green. When you get scared, you turn a little bit yellowish." And my response was touche. So definitely remember David Walker. He doesn't live long enough, unfortunately, to see slavery ended. He dies in 1830. But anyway, he pushes for freedom now as opposed to kind of a gradual emancipation. Now, one of the things that does come about is the British first thought of this, and the Americans kind of copy it. It's what's called this colonization society. And so you have some groups, due to prejudice and racism, now some abolitionists were very much saw African Americans as their equal, and they could assimilate in society and be like everybody else. But there were some, in fact, Abraham Lincoln was one that originally advocated for this until later in the American Civil War. But this American Colonization Society found in 1816, they thought, well, the best way to deal with recently freed slaves or free blacks is that you send them back to Africa. They're not fully going to be able to assimilate in society. And so there is the country in West Africa called Liberia. It's liberation. And its capital is called Monrovia because when this American Colonization Society was founded, James Monroe was president. They began sending free blacks to, if they chose to, back to Liberia. So anyway, there's really not a real anti-slavery sentiment in the North in the 1820s and 1830s. Yes, there are abolitionists. There are free blacks that are abolitionists. There are white, particularly pastors in the North that are abolitionists. But really, the abolitionist movement really takes off in the 1840s and especially in the 1850s. That is the decade before the Civil War that really gets abolitionist movement rolling. There's a difference between groups of abolitionists. Some said, all right, we should gradually emancipate. Plantation owners should be compensated for their slaves. Immediatists and so forth argued that you should do it right now. Now, the most famous abolitionist, other than David Walker, and probably William Lloyd Garrison, had a greater standing nationally. And in fact, Georgia, the state, hated him so much right before the Civil War that they offered a bounty on his head. If he was brought back to the state of Georgia, they were going to hang him. And David Walker didn't quite have that. So he had a little more famous and infamous to him. So his famous newspaper is called The Liberator. And he is very much an advocate of immediate emancipation. He's probably the most aggressive abolitionist in terms of in his writings. And he advocated complete racial equality and argued that slave owners should not be paid a single dime for the freeing of their slaves. So here's a newspaper heading of The Liberator. And also a guy who kind of gets overshadowed in American history by William Lloyd Garrison, but Theodore Dwight Weld. And he also co-founded the American Anti-Slavery Society with about 60 others. You also had a female version of that led by Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott's famous for being a women's rights activist. You'll see that most of the women that are involved in the abolitionist movement, not all, but a lot of them, will also be women's rights reformers as well. Now, Weld married two most famous female abolitionists, and that's the Grimke sisters. Actually grew up as daughters of a plantation in North Carolina. They fled to the north and were appalled to slavery. But Angelina married Theodore Weld, and they were very much both women reformers and abolitionists. And so they would kind of raise support financially to send out pamphlets, had signed petitions for the government and so forth. And also slave catchers that would come from the South to northern towns and try to capture runaway slaves, they would typically run them out of town and try to beat them up. Now, one of the most famous Americans of the 1800s, at least in American history, is a guy named Frederick Douglass, and tremendously brilliant guy. He taught himself how to read. Now, my mom was a first grade teacher for 35 years and taught reading for all of that 35 years. I don't think people realize how difficult it is to teach yourself how to read. So, incredibly brilliant man. His autobiography, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, because he was actually smart enough to, and because he was self-educated, he was able to create a forged pass that he was a free black living in the North, which is brilliant. The way he was able to forge it perfectly. But his autobiography was one of the most widely read books of the mid 1800s. It was like, I think, top 3 or top 4 most wide read books of the mid 1800s. He also had another newspaper called the North Star, and so forth. Now, there was an anti-slavery alphabet that had all these different rhymes and so forth. You can look it up if you like. This was a political cartoon at this time that showed how slavery kind of held up all these other terrible vices in society and so forth. And so is that the tree of slavery needs to be cut down and all this stuff will end. So this is abolitionist political cartoon. Another famous abolitionist and women's rights activist is Sojourner Truth, and she has been one of the more famous females of the 1800s. And there's another book about her called The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, written in 1850. So similar to Frederick Douglass, probably had more notoriety just because he was a male at the time. Now, the Underground Railroad, what this actually was a really not an actual railroad, but they would use code words that would use railroad terms to disguise what they were actually talking about. So I did have a student on an essay one time that did write that the Underground Railroad was a secret subway that would get slaves out of the South into the North. I can't make that up. That actually did happen. First year I was a teacher. So anyway, but you can see the different code words. So I want to show you this right here. This is each dot represents about 200 slaves in 1820. If you want to understand the impact of cotton cultivation and the invention of the cotton gin, as well as the demand for cheap cotton in the textile mills in New England and Great Britain, look at this. Boom. That is a ton. Now, that's not because of importation of new slaves. There was a few smuggled in, certainly, but the United States Navy tried to patrol and prevent that from happening. What takes it from this to this is just reproduction. There were high birth rates. Death rates are improving in the sense that they're not getting death rates are going down from a younger age. And one of the things that slave owners would offer mothers is if they had more children, they could obtain their freedom. Um, Now, you also notice there's big kind of gaping holes in some of this, and that's because Native Americans have not been removed to Oklahoma yet. We covered that in the Democratic Revolution lecture, or the Jacksonian era lecture, talking about the Indian Removal Act. So you can see the Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaw, Chickasaws, and also Seminoles being gone leads to this. Okay. And so another thing that there was this rule called the gag rule that was put into place where you couldn't even talk about slavery in Congress. The reason why is a former American president by the name of John Quincy Adams. He certainly had his faults, but not being an abolitionist was not one of them. And so when you watch your second film assignment, you watch about Amistad, and you'll see that John Quincy Adams defends the slaves in the movie. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's a fascinating story. It's a true story. And John Quincy Adams did actually defend them. But one of the reasons why that the gag rule was put in place is because he kept trying to push for abolition of slavery in Congress, and they basically put a gag rule to try to shut him up. So they wouldn't even accept an anti-slavery petition, which is really a violation of the democratic process. So one of the things you'll see too is that because of the issue of slavery, when the abolitionist movement takes off, the Baptist and Methodist churches will actually split over it. So that's why you have Northern Baptist denomination and Southern Baptist denomination. I'm not sure what the Methodists have, but you have a similar situation there. It's not like the Southern forms of those are pro-slavery today by any means, but that's why they split initially in the 1840s. Okay. And so one of the things that was a big backlash against the abolitionist movement is they're like, this is a violation of my private property, because in these slave owners' mindsets, slaves were seen like livestock. That's how inhumane that they viewed it at that time. And so they're like, well, this is my property. I paid money for this. They didn't really understand the deeper issue. So maybe they were living in denial. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe they liked their extravagant lifestyle they were living, or some of them weren't even living extravagant lifestyles. They were just getting by. But nonetheless, that was entrenched in them. And so, but one thing you have to understand about the abolitionist movement and also slavery at this time is that the South is not entirely to blame. Now, the South shares a big portion of that blame, but one of the reasons why abolition was not passed in Congress until 1865 was that a lot of northern textile mill owners were complicit to slavery because they were making money, greater profits, and could compete with the British in terms of prices, thanks to American tariffs, if they were getting cheap slave-produced cotton. Okay. Once they no longer have that, they move their textile mills to the South to take advantage of not having to pay for shipping costs. And so that's one of the reasons why you see that these northern merchants and textile mill owners favored slavery, is because it meant more profits for them. One of the things that you need to understand as well is that factory workers didn't want slaves freed because they didn't want free blacks moving up to the north and taking their jobs. It was job competition. And also the anti-slavery movement also was divided over the issue of women's rights. When Garrison and Theodore Weld advocated for women's rights, the American Anti-Slavery Society split over it. And so the American and foreign anti-slavery sprung up to just be abolition only. So you see that even reform movements are divided over this issue of women's rights and abolition. There was even a specific political party at this time called the Liberty Party that was founded solely as opposed to the spread and slavery in general. It only lasts for a couple elections. They do pick Martin Van Buren to run for them at one point, American history, but they eventually kind of absorb into the Republican Party in the 1850s. All right, so let's talk about arguably the second biggest. This intemperance was probably a tie for the second biggest reform movements of this time, and that is women's rights. So let's talk about really what the women's rights movement actually pushed for. So by joining religious revivals and reform movements like the Temperance Crusade and the abolitionist movement, women had entered public life. In 1848, women began to demand complete equality with men, and that's the right to inherit property. Typically, when a wife, if their parents had died and they were the only child, they'd have a brother, they would inherit the property. But when they married their husband, their property rights automatically went to their husbands. Now, it's not an issue if you're planning on staying married, but you didn't want, let's say you married a guy, he died suddenly, it would go to his son or your son instead of you. Where today, it goes to the other spouse, and so forth. Also, divorce was very rare, but one of the things that you did see divorce for was abandonment, and that was common for alcoholic fathers, people that maybe squandered their wealth or something like that, or downright physical abuse. Usually, the woman would, if they could get away, would run away. That actually happened to Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel. So one of the things that you'll see is they want the right to initiate divorce. Now, let's say your husband abandoned you and he flees off and goes out west in the gold rush. Well, he could be the only one that could issue a file for divorce. So, but he's abandoned you. He's not providing for you. Instead of the wife being able to go get a divorce decree to allow her to remarry another guy that can help provide for her financially, or somebody she fell in love with, she was not able to do that because of these laws and so forth. So women in the early 19th century or 1800s were unable to vote, legal status of a child. When they were single, could own their own property. Once they married and went to their husband, could not initiate divorce, could not make wills, sign a contract, or bring suit in court without her husband's permission. They were not allowed to vote, obviously, and obviously were not allowed to serve on juries. And a lot of times even testify in a court of law. So no bueno. And so this Republican motherhood that we talked about in Module 2 evolves into what's called the cult of domesticity. And so this idea that the women's sphere, their place is in the home. And so one of the things that you'll see is her role is to civilize her husband and family. And so this is from an 1830s Massachusetts minister. The power of a woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection. Her character becomes, and I'm sorry, that cut off on my screen. So basically, the Second Great Awakening, which encouraged women to lead prayer meetings, lead these missionary societies, it gave them a voice. And so you don't have the women's rights movement, at least at this time in American history, that's Second Great Awakening. And this form of Christianity inspires women to take a greater, more active role. So here's Angelina Grimke, who married Theodore Weld. This is her sister, Sarah. These are Southern abolitionists. Lucy Stone, other famous female abolitionist and women's rights activist. Okay. And so this right here, you need to take notes on the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. It will appear on a quiz question. Who knows if you'll get that question or not, but chances are you might. It will be on the test, and also it's on like pretty much every AP U.S. history exam out there. There's been essays about the women's rights movement and so forth. But the Seneca Falls Convention happened in 1848. They wrote this Declaration of Independence for themselves, and they basically took the wording of the original Declaration of Independence and put in that all men and women were created equal. And just like the original Declaration of Independence had a list of grievances against King George III, they put a list of grievances against men. Now, it wasn't like that they were hating on men. Don't understand that. Don't misunderstand that. They were married, had sons, had husbands, and so forth. It is saying, here's how women have been wronged and persecuted and so forth, and they've been denied their basic rights. Okay. This is a political cartoon against women's rights movement, saying that if women had their way, men would be at home taking care of the children. That was not actually the case, and so forth. And also that they hate on men and so forth. That's not really that way. Lucretia Mott, famous female women's rights activist, also Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, they were both at Seneca Falls. Susan B. Anthony comes later. She joined the movement in the 1850s. So she's probably her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are probably the most well-known women's rights activists in American history. But Susan B. Anthony joins the movement a little bit later. So she was not at the Seneca Falls Convention. Sorry, it's called Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. Now, they also wanted educational, professional opportunities, property rights, legal equality, and also repeal of laws awarding the father custody of children divorced. Now, typically today in American history and American society, when there's a divorce, the mother gets usually full custody or at least joint custody, unless the mother is incompetent or abusive or something like that. So, but they're pushing for the right to vote. That's always, if you remember nothing else about the women's rights movement, just remember they're pushing for the right to vote. You can read that if you like. Some of the grievances. This is a quote from Susan B. Anthony that if you want to read, you can as well. Now let's get to prison and insane asylum reform. This will be an important, but in a short one, I'll cover it very quickly. And so this is terrible that this happened, but this is not unique to the United States. It's happened in other parts of the world. But if somebody was mentally disabled, there were no mental health hospitals. If they were really mentally disabled, they would put them kind of in a state prison because they didn't know how to handle them. They would chain them up, put them in stockades. It is one of the things in American history that will break your heart, is how mentally disabled people were treated. I had a mentally disabled neighbor growing up, and he went to a mental health school and a mental health facility as an adult and so forth. And because he was properly taken care of and humanely taken care of, he was able to get the medical and psychological treatment that he needed. And so really there is I think she's one of the most incredible women in American history. Got a lady by the name of Dorothy Dix. And it wasn't really a reform movement that she wasn't involved in, but she's most known for prison and insane asylum reform. And so one of the things that she did is she provided, helped states establish insane asylums. Now, we don't use that term anymore today, but it's basically a mental health hospital. So we have mental health hospitals today because of the efforts of Dorothy Dix and others like her that push for that. The other thing is that prisoners were beaten, whipped, kind of very isolated confinement and so forth. So what she established, among other reformers with her, she's not the only one, but she's just the most well-known, they began reforming the inmate, so to speak, the convict. And now it's crazy, but it's because today in the United States, we have the highest percentage of population in prison than any other country in the world. But there was a time for 120 years or so, the United States had the model prison system. Okay, now my father worked for the Arkansas Department of Corrections until he retired. He was either a juvenile delinquent counselor or worked in the mental health wing of the Arkansas Department of Corrections and did psych evaluations on convicted felons. He did that for combined 37 years of his career. And so this is kind of near to my family. And but these prisons were designed on reforming the individual, and they were successful. Here's Dorothy Dix. I would take notes on her and highlight her. Famous American woman. She also was a nurse later in the American Civil War for the North. So they began focus on just punishment, but rehabilitation. And it was designed to try to prevent suicide rates and so forth. And they, instead of erasing prisoners' identity and so forth, they did try to convert them to Christianity. And so typically in prison, you can get any religious text that you want. The Quran, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Analects, whatever you want to read religiously, they'll let you have in prison. And it really became the model of Western European countries, what we do in the United States. Okay. This is what a prison would look like back then. Now, let's get to right behind abolition, along with women's rights, temperance. Temperance is one of the longest reform movements in American history. This is a political cartoon against alcohol consumption, saying that gin, rum, brandy, and whiskey are going to lead to all these terrible vices in American society. Now, you got to understand, though, about temperance. As I mentioned earlier, the average American drinks 7 gallons of liquor a year. And so you have a couple of major problems that was taking place that in a lot of ways would justify a temperance movement. One is that as the first phase of the Industrial Revolution was happening, a lot of these factory workers were doing such monotonous, boring, and dangerous work that many of them were drinking themselves. That's how they dealt with it. Well, they were showing up to the workplace drunk and were having accidents and causing damage to themselves or to other coworkers and even leading to death. So you had factory owners that were oftentimes temperance reformers. And then you also had the other side is not just a moral argument, but also poverty. they saw it as those that drank the most were the poorest. And so those who could least afford it drank it the most. And so that was true. And you look at today in American society, where are the majority of liquor stores? Are they located in wealthy neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods? It's poor neighborhoods. And so those were two of the arguments that I always try to tell students, that they don't fully understand why they had a temperance movement. Okay. Now, there's also the moral aspect of it as well, but I think students typically understand that the Second Great Awakening argues that it's immoral to drink alcohol. It leads to child abuse and abandonment of your spouse, and other ills, prostitution and so forth, and gambling, and among other things. So some of the famous temperance reformers are Lyman Beecher, Neil Dowd, also Lucretia Mott. Hey, Lucretia Mott, she was a women's rights activist. So a lot of times you'll see reformers be involved in multiple reform movements. So you have this American Temperance Society that formed in Boston in 1826. They would get people to sign pledges, particularly at these Second Great Awakening camp meetings or tent revival meetings. And they would have people take oaths and pledges to stop drinking. And there was a famous pamphlet that passed around called 10 Nights in a Barroom, and what I saw there about the immorality that was taking place in bars and taverns. So if you look how much alcohol consumption had increased in the first part of the Industrial Revolution, look how much it plummets between 1820 and 1870. That's because of the temperance movement. Now you can see then it shoots up in 1920, but that's even after Prohibition was passed, and that's because you have the Roaring Twenties and the bootlegging. This is another, what the drunkard's progress leads to, gambling and being fighting and poverty and eventually suicide is what it eventually leads to. So the Pilgrim's Progress, or they call it the drunkard's progress. Now, with education reform that you will see develop at this time, is that education had cost money for a lot of states and students. And so one of the things you'll see with education reform is tax-funded education. And so that's the big thing about education reform. It's the last reform we'll talk about. And so instead of having to pay for a private tutor, and typically when kids went, like a farming community went to school, they had to pay each week to their teacher. If you were a poor farming family, you couldn't afford that. So if you were really poor, then your children would be illiterate. And so when you think of education reform, it's real simple: tax-funded public education. Okay, and these are middle-class reformers that push for this, and they thought that education reform was key to reforming society in general. Now, the most famous education reformer is a guy named Horace Mann. A lot of my students called him Horseman, but his name is Horace Mann. He helped founded the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and also they developed the nine-month school calendar year, and that's because of farming and also the industry. And so they thought that pupils or children needed to be able to work in the summer for their family farms. That's why you guys get the summers off. Anyway, you end up having school budgets increase because of tax-funded thing. They also founded new colleges and universities, and they also founded Oberlin College that was designed to train specifically teachers. And you end up having throughout the 1800s teachers colleges established, like Texas A&M Commerce in East Texas was designed originally as a teachers college. Henderson State University was originally a teachers college, and Southwest Arkansas. And you also had some famous women educators as well, and they began pushing for female colleges, seminaries, and universities. And that also gets established.